Patricia, thanks for joining the show.
Thank you for having me.
Is that so? We are going to be talking about the misconceptions and the myths around financial literacy around the world. Okay. And you're an excellent guest because you live, you breathe these types of things every day. And so we'll just kick right off into it. I mean, one of the first things that come to mind is, people dealing with money on a day-to-day basis, they think they have financial literacy skills, right? But statistics show that only 1 out of every 3 people around the world actually has financial literacy skills. What do you think perpetuates that myth that because I handle money, I have some sort of financial literacy skills, or I'm able to manage money just by simply being with it? Why do you think people think that or believe that?
Well, as you said, you're dealing with it all the time. So you think because you're dealing with it, somehow you're in control of it. But as you know, debt levels are spiraling out of control. Young people even are getting themselves into debt, living off their credit cards, not particularly well managing their student loans, taking out extra loans, and not understanding what APR is, for example. Something as straightforward as that. Many people, in terms of maths, the annual percentage rate. I was shocked when I came back to this country because I've been living in Germany for some time. And there they don't actually take out much credit. They deal with everything in cash. And in this society, we are taught to, have credit cards when in fact it's a debt card. Let's be honest. It's a whole word play. You're in credit, but you're actually getting yourself into debt. So coming from living in a society where they deal with everything in cash and coming back here and realizing how so many people are getting these, what you call CCJs, taken to court because they're in debt, they're spiraled out of control, because most people, in fact, we're just living just above the line you need to keep things going. And people want things, and so they're buying things, but the income that's coming in, the salary is not enough, and so they're living off their credit card or then taking out extra loans. And so that's when I was shocked when I first came back here, and I kept seeing, do you have problems with CCJ? And I was saying to myself, what is this CCJ? So this is something that really hit me when I came back to this country and saw how many people were having problems managing their debt. And it causes a lot of financial problems, cause a lot of mental stress, a lot of anxiety. So I think to be more informed about what your finances mean, how you make money, how you save money, how you invest money, will be better for your well-being as well.
You mentioned something that was very interesting, which was almost around the marketing part of things, right? You were being very transparent when you said this is a debt card, not necessarily a credit card, right? And so I think of the ways in which we have been, I don't want to say conditioned, but we
have. Yeah, we have been conditioned.
Well, we have been conditioned, yes. But the marketing messaging or the ease of use of money has become very different compared to what it was 10, 15 years ago. So now I use contactless. I just, have a tap.
Tap. You don't pay out the money. You don't see it.
Exactly.
So, all these things means that you don't really, kind of physically bond with it. And so it's just like you're spending. It's almost like you have to spend to save. Buy one, get one free. But in fact, you end up spending more in order to get more. So it's almost encouraging you, buy more and you'll save more. But of course, when you're buying, when you're not investing in an asset, something that will then appreciate over time, or, for instance, a flat, a house, something like that. So if you're just buying consumables and then you're going to get something else again, then you're not actually, you're reducing your net worth. Yeah. By just spending on clothes and things that will go out of fashion, you get something else again. So, there is a lot of conditioning around money. And that's something, it's not something that I've had to learn late in life. I think particularly, I come from an academic background, educationalist. And, the idea was you go to school, you do well, you get good grades, you get a good job and you earn money. That's not the case anymore. That's not the case. You have people who've gone to school, put their nose down, got good grades, and they're still not working. Because the whole world of work is changing rapidly. And so, for instance, you've got children who go into primary school now. By the time they finish school, they predict with the whole advent of the fourth industrial revolution rapidly going on to the fifth, that, about 65% of the jobs will not be here. They will be automated or changed radically. So, but one of the things that will be around, we will have to have some way of a transaction where we give something for something else in return. And if we're not bartering, eggs for consultancy or, a hairdo for clothes. Some people are doing that, by the way. Some people are actually going back to bartering. But in the meantime, we'll have, whether it's cryptocurrency or whatever it is, we will have some sense of a money transaction. But I think in terms of education, it goes deeper than that. I think it's about what we hold dear, what we value. And worth and value, and putting a figure on that. So, for instance, why I'm saying that is, for instance, women in particular, we have gender inequality, pay gaps. Women, got the same qualifications as men, doing the same work as men. And yet, in this 21st century, we have massive pay gaps between women and men, and they're doing exactly the same work, come through the same system. So what is that about? I think in the end, it's also, apart from whether you want to call it sexism or gender discrimination, it's also to do with women not feeling worthy, and that we need to be more assertive about our value, our worth. And so, for instance, that recent thing on the BBC where that woman was being paid, £400 a thing, and the other one was paying £3,000. I mean, what is that about? And everybody was okay with it until she raised it. So, it's this whole wealth notion, money notion. It's something I think we need to unpack, and we need to unpack it with young people in schools.
I completely agree with you, because this is something that's not traditionally taught to you unless your parents are savvy with investing, and also depends on where you were raised, right?
Exactly.
I mean, if you were raised in a developing economy, or in Botswana, South Africa, or in the UK, your notion and understanding of finance is very different. There were some statistics I was looking at where they were showing the average literacy rates amongst different people in the world. And there is a stark difference between, the UK or Europe versus African countries, for instance. But there's one thing that you actually said that was pretty interesting to me, which was about women specifically. There is this idea or myth, I think, that's perpetuated out there that women aren't so good with money. They're not financially savvy, right? but you hear this, and it's kind of ridiculous.
It is ridiculous.
You see things, if you see the CEO of a bank or something like that, or you imagine people that are good with money, the image that comes to your mind is a trader on the floor, or someone that is an investor, or that's what you typically think of. Why do you think there is that myth out there that women are not as financially literate as men? Is there a root
let's
of
put it this way. I'm going to turn it on its head. If we left men to run the household finances, where do you think we would be?
Good question.
I mean, a woman can make, you can give her 2 and she make 5. I don't know how or where, but it's in terms of ingenuity, creativity, investing in the right way, knowing how to make a little stretch far. And one of the things I think when you've been in a position of not as powerful, equally powerful, you learn to make do with less. And that is like thriftiness, or what you would call it, frugality. You learn to make do with less and limit your aspirations. And I think that's also to do with self-worth. Because I remember I had a session with some young students. We were working on a report on gender equality. And I said it to the women. I said, listen, who does the cooking in the home? Mainly, mother. Who are the top chefs? Men. Who manages all the money at home? Women. Who are all the top bankers? Men. Who takes care of you, looks after your illness? And who are they? Women. Who are the top consultants in the medical? Men. So as soon as it becomes a position of power, worth, and value, men are there. Whereas if it's something that's everyday and ubiquitous, I mean, what I'm talking about is not, it's women. So that, I think, is where the rethinking has to be. And we have to rid those stereotypes, women ourselves first and girls coming up. We have to say that if we are doing something that is of equal worth and equal value, we should be paid equally.
I think that's a great point, actually. I mean, that's something we don't necessarily think about. Now that you've put it into those two distinct lanes, right? When there's someone of power, then we ascribe it to men. When it's everyday sort of things, it's usually women. And why there's that chasm between the two, I guess it's something that people just don't really think about. I personally haven't even thought about it in those rails, but that's an excellent point. You mentioned something about people that have less being more thrifty with money and, being a bit more savvy. Where I'm going with this is, I grew up in Botswana in Africa, and there, they have lower incomes than in the West part of the world. And so people with less money, obviously they're thrifty, they're savvy. And the notion is that if you give these people credit cards, or you give them access to a bank account or something like that, that will instantly improve their financial literacy, that'll help them, get to a better place financially. Is that really the case? Whereby it's more so that people that are in need just need access to financial instruments, and that'll help them improve their financial literacy and end up being wealthy? Or is it more than just access to financial instruments?
I think if one became wealthy just by having access, it would be a different picture. I think there are structures and organizations that helps to perpetuate and create and build assets, which can then be passed down from generation to generation. I mean, that's real wealth. I'm not talking about just earning a lot of money. I'm talking about, so that you're leaving behind inheritance, and that's been passed down through your generations, like Rothschild, from South Africa, from the diamonds, etc., Cadbury family, De Beers family. If we're talking about wealth and how people think that's different, so they're looking a long-term plan. Whereas I think when you are living with little, you're talking about survival. And when you're only dealing with survival, that gives you, I think, tremendous resilience. You take things in your stride, other things that would knock other more affluent people to one side. You will take it with your stride and you will keep going. But what it does do, it doesn't help you to plan far ahead, to the next generation. The difference being, I would just add, farmers. For instance, if you're planting a tree that might not actually flourish until well into your child's lifetime, you are planning ahead. 20 years, a tree that, 20 or 30 years you are. But I'm talking about, say, in the more urban settings. So what I've been interested in the last sort of about 3 years has been pioneering this notion of education for wealth.
Just before you go on to that, a lot of people don't understand that distinction between being rich or having a high income and wealth, right? Because they're two different things. In your opinion, what is the fundamental difference between those two things?
Well, in monetary terms, I think to be in the wealthy category, you're talking about more than millionaires, and you're talking about assets that can be then, as I said, sent down your generations. I think wealth for me, actually, wealth is more than money. And I wanted to talk about that. That's why when I go on about education for wealth. But in the financial sense, I think, being a high income earner, those people who are in those kind of brackets, they're making sure that they're making investments, whether it's for pension pots, whether it's a second, third or fourth home, whether it's investments in other kinds of portfolios, property which bring returns, or investing venture capital, those kinds of things. They're doing that. Whereas I think most of us have just been taught to become, you could even call it like a wage slave. Yeah. So you're going incrementally up the ladder, and it's very incrementally, very small, particularly in the UK. I think in the US you have bigger jumps and more scope, but here I think it is very measured and very small jumps. So wealth, what I've come to understand wealth to be now is far more encompassing than money. For instance, particularly that's what I've learned from when I've been going abroad, talking about or listening to people about education for wealth. If you haven't got your health, so if you're talking about education for wealth, as we have been in somewhere like the Gambia, where you haven't even got a cardiologist for the population, or, cancer specialists, or you have, all these. So what does it mean then? You go to school, you get sick, you die. So some other people are saying health is wealth. In terms of from a country perspective, which is what we have been doing, we've been talking about that. How is wealth created for your country? Yeah. And that's where we've been talking about, let's talk about different African countries. It's not about aid. It's about trade and investment and taxing. In other words, that your peoples are earning, whether it's as an entrepreneur or as a job, so that they're able to contribute to the state wealth, so then that services can be provided. So that means that they have to have sovereignty over their vast resources. I mean, how is it you can have so many African countries that are so cash poor when they're so, the richest, it's the richest planet it's the richest continent on the planet in terms of what it has, from water to oil to diamonds to coltan to uranium to everything. So it's about sustainable industries. It's about your sovereignty over your land and your waters. So we've been looking at education for wealth to educate the population to see what they have, and not just thinking we are poor, we just need handouts from the West. Do you see what I'm saying?
I completely see what you're saying. So
that it's been actually really interesting because, as I said, I started with Gambia, which is one of the poorest countries and smallest countries in Western Africa. And I happened to have lived there for 6 years. I was the head of their top international school there. And, and that's where I saw a different side of the elite and how they manage money and manage status. But it wasn't until I'd come here and gone back there and this idea of education for wealth, because usually in developing countries, you're talking about education for poverty reduction, education for higher quality, but no one is making the direct link between, if you are going to invest in all this money, how is that going to make people and your country more economically developed? Making those links much more explicit. And I think that is very important, because you have a situation where, families, villages even, put together to send someone abroad to get some degree or whatever. And if they don't come back, where has all that investment gone? They are leaving the country and not coming back. So what we were actually trying to talk was, how do you educate for not only individual wealth, but for a country's wealth? And even more so to that point is, if a family gets together, puts their resources in one person, they come over to the US, UK, whatever it is, and they get educated, but they are still conditioned to this mentality of a salary sort of wage slave. They never actually break through that income, generation trap and become wealthy. So they're having to work with, 20, 30, whatever, 50,000 pounds to try and service their quote unquote loan for their family back at home. But the only way that they can really free those people is if they become entrepreneurs or, really break into that wealth class that we're thinking of, that allows him to actually improve the lives of the people that helped him or her to get to where they're trying to get to. Something else that comes to mind is culture, right? The role of culture in financial literacy and education. And the reason why I ask this is because, in the United States, it's a big part of it. It's a very capitalistic society. And, there's a big push to always educate your friends on, stocks and, wealth and all that kind of stuff. It's part of the culture. In Botswana, for instance, where I grew up, which actually has one of the highest, in fact, the highest financial literacy rate in Africa of all the African countries, it's about 55%. Even there, I didn't really hear too much about, stocks and bonds and investing and those types of things. So I guess my question here is, the myth that culture doesn't play a role
in financial literacy. What do you say to that? What role have you seen that culture plays in financial education, passing down generational wealth, and all those types of things?
If we strip back culture and just use it as the way we do things, yeah? If you grow up in a family which has for generations sent their children to Eton, yeah, so it's not a question of where you're going. You're going there, and therefore you're going to have friends who are at the top of the tree in terms of top of the military, top of medical, top of the judiciary, top of journalism. So the way you do things is, you know that if you have an issue or problem, mummy and daddy's friends or your friend's going to sort it out. So the way that you do things, your culture really does makes that imprint and how you move through society, whether you think you're entitled or not, whether you see an issue, whether you think, it can be done or not. For instance, you need 20,000, you need 1 million. Most people will think, they wouldn't even think about that because they wouldn't even know where to start. Whereas if you've been in that track, that privileged track, that culture of entitlement, that's not an issue. So therefore you can dream bigger, you can plan bigger. Now, if you've lived in a hand-to-mouth existence where, it's been success and failure, and if there is a failure, there isn't a cushion. Because being an entrepreneur, there is failure built in. For instance, in my own family, my father actually never went to school beyond 11. But he managed to set up a business, 3 businesses, to finance his 8 children. I'm the eldest of 8. So, he took those risks, he invested, and, in terms of he'd come from nothing, but was savvy enough to make business and found a niche product. Unfortunately, he went bankrupt. There was no cushion for us. But my mother, who was a nurse, knows how to make things work, protected us so that we had our house, we weren't taken into care, we didn't lose everything. But growing up from that culture was, things can just suddenly go. So there was, it wasn't a sort of an inheritance or an allowance as many of, say, my friends in my private school. I went to private school when I was 11. So would have that, they were given cars. And I think, my goodness, we had a bike to share between 4 of us. So, it was just like a different world. So your culture, your family setup, and the culture from which you plays a tremendous part in terms of how you view the world and how you therefore think you can impact the world. Now, if education is supposed to be the leveler, which they say it is, I don't think it is, but, if let's say that's what we want it to be, then it should be about unlocking people's minds to what is out there and how things can be done differently so that we manage debt, that we learn about saving and investment, we learn about coming together and putting in our pot. And I think I'm seeing that actually, especially amongst your generation, like, for instance, the disruption of fintech and, Wealthify and all these kinds of things that you don't have to have, a portfolio of 10,000 to minimum or 25,000 to invest. You could do it with £1. And that way of how technology is democratizing wealth and access to information, I find that really a good thing.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. In fact, I was actually thinking about that just before we had this conversation. There's a notion that you need to have a lot of money in order to start investing or in order to start growing your wealth. It's like, well, because I can only put £5 in today, I might as well not and just get that cafe latte or whatever it is. But helping people understand the power and effects of compounding, and especially once you have a family and you start to plan 20 to 30 years ahead in advance, it's just a different mindset, a different sort of shift in the way you view money and the longevity of money. And you really start to, have a different relationship with money, because at the end of the day, it is a relationship with money, right?
Everyone has a tool.
It's a tool. that's a mentality shift that I even had to have, because there was a point in my life when I really thought money was the goal, right? I want to be rich enough to be able to get certain things. But now that I've, had a bit of a change in mindset, it's the tool that'll allow me to get freedom, to be able to spend my time the way I want to, or to give my kids a certain level of privilege or that I would like them to grow up with, so that they are not confined to this everyday I need to survive kind of mentality, because then you go from a world where you're constricted to a world where you look at possibilities, right? And, it's a very different mindset. There was something that I remember I read in a book called Rich Dad, Poor Dad or something like that, whereby...
I bought that for my son.
Yeah, I bought it for my brother just the other week, honestly. And it's a great book. And it was primarily around, the average person or a poor person would say, oh man, I can't afford that thing, so I can't get it.
Yeah.
But someone that thinks in a different way would say, I can't afford that, but how can I afford that?
Yeah.
Right? Because then that unlocks the mind to be creative and start to think of different ways to do things, right? But just thinking about trying to get someone to have that mind shift, regardless of where they fall in the economic structure, it seems to be a bit of a battle, right? You must be lucky enough to come upon this book, or you must have some life experience that makes you want to change. In your experience of trying to educate people to do this, what's the biggest barrier you see to actually getting people to change their mind or change their thinking about wealth, about the barriers they've put for themselves, all those types of things? What are some things that people have put on themselves or self-imposed that are not letting them start to think about wealth or growth or any of those things?
Self-belief. If you've been brought up to think that you're nothing and you never will amount to very much, then you're not going to think big. And I think that, and particularly in Britain, where you have I still think, a rigid class structure of, the working class, or, and those who are not even there, and, the so-called middle class, and the upper, then the one at the top. So I think there's quite a structure. You're supposed to know your place. So I think it is about self-belief and knowing who you are. And I think once you start to tap into that will transform a lot. It's not just about wealth. It's around so many other different things. Your relationship to yourself, your relationship to people around you, your relationship to the world. There's nothing more, I think, for me, in terms of education, more distressing than seeing in the eyes of a child or a young person someone who doesn't believe they can do. There's no point. They can't do it. Whatever it is, whether it's a math problem, chemistry problem, I can get a job or whatever. And it's that, for young people growing up nowadays, it's not easy. I think there's a lot of pressure to achieve and to do, but the financial context of where we're living right now, for instance, when I first bought my first flat, I bought it for under 20 grand. That shows you how old I am as well. And now for a young person to buy something similar, you're talking about more like 200,000.
Even that's on the conservative side.
And salaries have not gone tenfold. So, as they say, for a first-time buyer, is the average, was it 35 or something like that? I mean, therefore, what do you do between 18 and 35? You're living at home, all those pressures, you want to have some freedom, you want to have a boyfriend, girl, whatever, you're independent, like how are you going to do that, where are you going to do that, how is it going to happen? So, I think it is about stepping back and thinking differently. So accessing information like Rich Dad, Poor Dad, challenging a lot of the myths. I mean, for me, it's still, as I'm listening to you speak about all this, I'm thinking, oh gosh, I've still got to do that for myself. So, I don't want to say for things for other people that I don't think, it's been a hard and long journey. But I think it is absolutely necessary. Otherwise, we're never going to get anywhere. If someone doesn't dream that something else is possible and are driven to get it, we're not going to move. For instance, if I talk back about my ancestors, if someone didn't say, why should I be a slave? Why should I be on this plantation? Who is the master? How can he or she be better than me? Where would I be? So, but I think who is going to be the vanguard of this type of thinking are the entrepreneurs. the young people now.
Yeah.
I really do believe, because they don't want to do the 9 to 5. They want to work for themselves. And it's hard. It is hard. It's not easy because, it's the one thing you have to pay every month is your bills. But in terms of being an entrepreneur, you might get a big contract, might get that 10,000. But if you don't get it for the year, you've worked for 10,000 for the year, yeah? So, but your outgoings are, about 30.
Yeah.
So, simple budgeting will show you that. So, but what I think entrepreneuring teaches you is resilience and determination. And you have to believe in yourself and your product. And that kind of drive is the risk taking and the wealth making people. But I think what is lacking is you can't just do it on your own. And you will need to team up, consortia or groups, family. And that's how you consolidate it. You can't just be an individual that's making a lot of money. It's more than that.
You mentioned two things that really stand out to me. One of which was, or at least something that I thought about while you were talking, was necessity is the mother of all invention, right? I feel like our generation has been sort of cornered into a bit of a position whereby we saw what was possible in 30 or 40 years time ago, or years ago, should I say, in your generation's time. And we felt like we want to live that kind of lifestyle. We want to be able to afford a home pretty easily. And so out of that necessity, we've been forced to, become entrepreneurs or do certain things, because we have to almost inculcate that self-belief that I want to achieve more than what I'm being handed over, what my current situation or whatever's being handed to me by the government for previous generations and all those types of things. So, there is that sort of back against the wall kind of mentality. And it's like, I got to go for broke because I really got not much to lose, right? I'm only going to get a house when I'm 35 anyway. So if I get it even at 29 or 32, I'm 3 or 4 years ahead of the curve, So that's one thing that stands out to me. And the second one was about risk, right? That risk aversion versus, propensity to actually take on risk. It's a very interesting dynamic, because obviously there's a risk reward dynamic that most people need to think about, right? You don't take any risks, there's no reward, and vice versa. I was hoping to get your thoughts on the myth that there's such a thing as sort of risk-free pathways to wealth. You know what I mean? Some people think, I just put it into a passive fund or whatever it is, or there is a way to achieve what I want to achieve without taking on risk. How do we sort of bust that myth and let people, actually understand, look, there's a lot of risk involved if you want to become wealthy, or if you really want to make that big leap, because, nothing comes easy. How do you, you alluded to it actually a bit, which was in terms of self-belief in yourself, right? But that whole notion of risk, how do you get someone to be able to even calibrate, what risk is, what it's not to be too cautious, but not to be overly, invested in it? How do you help someone develop that skill set?
Risk management and risk analysis, I think one of the most powerful questions, which is an educational thing, is how to do something. Like you said that, I can't afford that, but how do I get it? How? So your mind, it starts thinking about, how? First I do this, and then I do this and this, and then I do that. With risks, one of my key business partner, he's he takes a lot of opportunity, but at the same time, he doesn't shy away from looking at the risks. Because people think once you put down all the barriers, all the things that can go wrong, that's it, and that stops you. But no, you put them down so that you mitigate them. And that's the skill. You identify all the things that go wrong. So if that happens, then what are you going to do? Or if that happens, then what are you going to do? And the fact that you've thought ahead. So you're not just going, yes, I've designed this product. I'm going to sell 1 million and I'm going to be, it's going to make me 1 million. I'm going to sell 1 million and it's going to be £1 each and £1 million, and that's it. No, you've got to have that kind of, obviously that drive and passion that you think, but at the same time, someone who is planning to be wealthy, they are also looking about risks and which risks they're willing to take and which risks they're not willing to take. Apparently the first 1 million is the hardest. After that, it becomes easier.
I've heard the same thing too. I haven't gotten to that stage yet, but hopefully I'll find out for myself.
Yeah. But, I think it's about, as I said, It's not about, there are risks, but they can be mitigated. Some of them, you don't even need to go there. If you see it's such a red flag, then no, that is madness. Yeah. We don't want to all jump off the cliff together. No.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but there's other ones you can look at that and you can say, well, okay, that could happen, but then what? So it's like when you're starting up a business, you might say, oh, we're going to make all this. Okay, but let's have a plan. What's our break even? So for instance, that's a form of a risk, isn't it? Actually working out what is the break even for that. I want to do, I've got T-shirts at $10 each. It's going to cost me this, my printing press, that, and the other. So how many do I need? So if it's going to cost break even 10,000, the point is, do you have 10,000 to lose? Or would you be willing, you and whoever your business partner, to take on that debt, and that will be okay? If that's okay, then go for it. But don't just, and then suddenly, oh my God, there's all this and we didn't know, and then your sleepless nights. No, you look at it from the beginning, and that means you're planning for success and also planning to mitigate failure.
There was an interesting statistic that I saw regarding sort of diversification in emerging versus developed economies. And I thought of that based on what you just said. I think on average, about 20% of people in emerging economies had a diversified portfolio, which was, them leveraging or sort of managing their risk, so to speak. But in developed economies was almost like 60% or something like that. So there's a difference there in understanding and calibrating risks, but also maybe your life circumstances dictate what kind of risks you're willing to take, right? If I lose this job, I don't have a support system. Maybe there's no social security or NHS system I can fall back on. So your level of risk is determined, I think, by yourself and your mitigating factors that you can control, but there's also some external factors that might influence that level of risk. Something else that I was thinking of was, there's a sort of myth that children can't understand finances, right? Which is trying to teach a 10-year-old or 11-year-old about financial literacy and, inflation or any of these types of things. It's almost sort of way beyond them or out of their reach. But some of my friends that I grew up in California or wherever it is, they are very successful because they've been taught these things since 9 or 10 years old, right?
Exactly.
Where do you think this myth of children
should be seen and not heard?
Yeah, something like
That's
that.
very Victorian.
But you know what I mean? Like they're not capable of learning these types of things, yet they can play the violin.
No, I think the 21st century now, the more that we can encourage our young people to learn, ask questions and to challenge, the better. I think the barrier lies with the elders not being able to say it or teach it in a way that makes it accessible to younger people, because that's a skill. But I think most people can understand it, So I think it's a way, finding ways of being able to teach that. For instance, off the thing, but linked to the whole thing of wealth is corruption. So let's say corruption, which is usually around money, backhanders, etc. I was in Nigeria and Uganda, and I was speaking about education for wealth. And we got onto this thing about corruption. I said, yes, I think we need to talk about that. You can teach children from primary school about ethics, about what it means to steal or do wrong or, bribing. And you can teach it. So once you lay those kind of fundamental frameworks and culture of how you do things differently, then you have a chance, so that people can make wealth for good. Because I think also our whole notion of money, for instance, I've come through sort of like the progressive political route. And within that, it's about the terrible capitalists and the good socialists. It's not quite like that, is it? It's not quite like that at all. So now that I'm an entrepreneur myself, I have my own business. It is about how do we invest and make money doing good, bringing the two together and actually making ethical decisions about what type of products we develop, which type of customer market segment are we targeting, what kind of impact are we seeking. So there is a way of being like a social entrepreneur.
I think there's a factor here, which is in terms of, corruption you mentioned it's a very individualistic thing, right? I'm going to do what's right for me, or I'm going to get that favor from my friend or whatever it is to get a leg up. But once you can educate someone on the fact that this individualistic sort of mentality is ultimately worse for not just the people around you, but for yourself, ultimately, because when you practice group economics or, everyone is in this together, it's sort of like growing the entire pie and not just trying to get a bigger slice of the smaller pie that's there, right? That mind shift to get people to think about, let's leverage our group. It could be any type of identity. It could be cultural. It could be, skin color. It could be gender, whatever it is. But sort of practicing group economics is something I don't see spoken about all that often, or it's spoken about in very sort of abstract ways. So if you're at your company, you get access to perks or something like that because you're part of a group there. But we can also form our own groups in order to leverage our buying power and things like that. Okay. How do you think we can cultivate a sort of group economics type of mentality?
The African Union is the example right now. The African Union have signed a continental free trade agreement. It is now the largest trading bloc on the planet. 54 countries. This is amazing. As we've just come out of Europe, to be on our own. Everybody else. In fact, and it was Kwame Nkrumah before the OAU who was talking about, in fact, all these ideas were first implemented by the European Union. Now, the AU. We're talking about a continental free passport. We're talking about regional currencies. So when you're talking about a bloc trading, that is the example right now we have on a massive scale. And especially as we have about, 5 to 6 of the fastest growing economies on the planet, on the African continent. Africa is rebranding, redirecting, transforming itself. And so I think we need to have a different narrative. Same way in terms of the black pound. Black economics. Yes.
That's interesting. I haven't heard of that.
We haven't really looked at the purchasing power of black people in this country sufficiently. People talk about, for instance, in certain other communities, the pound circulates within their community, the Jewish community, the Chinese community, other communities, before it goes into the wider national pot. Whereas for the black community, we're not sufficiently buying amongst ourselves and purchasing things amongst ourselves before it's going to the wider pot.
And it's not a bad thing, right? To practice group economics. Someone could think, that's kind of racist or whatever it is. But this is something that everyone else is in on except us, right? Which is kind of a bit weird. Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
And that's to do with education. That's to do with insufficient trust of self. And not thinking that, no, you can't trust that person, but you can trust someone else who doesn't know you, hasn't been with you, not of your heritage, not of your culture, not of your lived experience. So that says a lot. So it's all about education.
Fantastic. Well, those are most of the things we wanted to go through today. Thank you so much, Patricia. Really appreciate it. If you could just give us a couple minutes about, what you do currently at your role, and sort of a message that you'd like to get out there to the audience.
You know what? I should have planned this before I came. So Aspire Education Group is my company, and that includes gender-focused arm, GEDA, Gender Education Enterprise Development for Africa, and also Aspire Prep, the work that we do with young people locally. So we really try to embody thinking globally and acting locally. We're doing lots of events. We're even also looking for interns. That's coming up soon. So, if you're interested in being part of the movement, in that sense, we're part of, we're co-founders of something called Black Socks.
Okay.
Which is like a social action network, an economic development network. We've just come back from Uganda. We took 10 delegates to Uganda, sort of influencers to see, and we launched the report Education for Wealth, leveraging the fourth industrial revolution in Uganda. We printed and developed and wrote and launched that report there. And we're planning to go back with 100 people to East Africa next November.
Fantastic.
So, yeah.
Well, I'm sure you're going to have more than 100 signups. The queue will be out the door. But I'm definitely appreciative of the efforts that you're making, and we'll hope to have you back on the episode soon.
Thank you.
Cheers.